The north wind cut through the threadbare wool of Nora Elsbeth Doyle's coat as she stepped down from the mail coach, her boots sinking into the muddy slush of the Coyote Hill station. 28 years behind her, most of them hard, and she carried all she owned in a single canvas satchel clutched against her chest. The November sky hung low and gray, promising more snow before nightfall. She'd left the salt camps 3 days ago, where she'd spent the last 2 years cooking for miners who paid in copper coins and crude compliments. Before that, there'd been other camps, other kitchens, other towns whose names blurred together like the landscape seen through a frosted window. But it was Cedar Junction she couldn't forget, no matter how many miles she put between herself and that particular mistake. "End of the line, miss," the driver called down, already tossing luggage to the platform. "Unless you're heading back south." South, back to the salt camps, back to men who looked at her like she was something to be weighed and measured. Purchased if the price was right. Her jaw tightened. "No, sir, this is my stop." The station wasn't much a wooden platform warped by weather. A small office with smoke curling from its chimney, and a handful of folks waiting for mail or supplies. Nora stood apart from them, conscious of her patched dress and the dust that seemed permanently etched into the creases of her hands. She'd scrubbed them raw this morning at the last way station, but some kinds of dirt went deeper than skin. A year ago, she'd been foolish enough to believe a man's promises. Calvin Hartley had swept into Cedar Junction with his fine clothes and finer words, talking about opportunities back east, about needing a good woman to help him build something respectable. She'd been 27 then, old enough to know better but desperate enough to hope, when he'd suggested they anticipate their wedding vows just that once. Just to seal their commitment, she'd let her guard down, let him into her small room above the boarding house, let him take what he wanted with promises of tomorrow. Tomorrow never came. She'd woken to find $40 on the nightstand and a note that said simply, "For your troubles." The memory still burned, not just the abandonment but the assumption that she was the type of woman who could be bought, that one night defined her worth. She'd thrown the money in the fire and watched it burn, then packed her bag and left Cedar Junction before the gossip could start. But gossip had a way of traveling faster than a woman on foot, and she'd been looking over her shoulder ever since. "You the cook headed to the Merrick place?" Nora startled. A man stood near the platform's edge, tall enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. Everything about him was understated brown pants, brown coat, brown hat pulled low against the wind. Even his horse, tied to the hitching post, was an unremarkable bay. But something in his stillness made her nervous, the way he seemed to occupy space without trying to fill it. "I am," she said, lifting her chin slightly. "Mr. Merrick." He nodded once, no smile, no welcome, no questions about her journey. Just that single economical movement, his eyes gray as the sky above took her in with a glance that seemed to catalog everything without judgment. She'd grown used to men's eyes lingering on her figure, making calculations. This man's gaze simply acknowledged her existence and moved on. "Storm's coming," he said. "We'd best get moving if we want to reach the ranch before it hits." That was all. No small talk about the weather, no inquiries about her references, no subtle attempts to gauge what kind of woman would travel alone to work at an isolated ranch. He turned toward his horse, clearly expecting her to follow. Nora hefted her satchel and started after him, then stopped. "Mr. Merrick, is there a wagon?" He paused, looking back. "You ride?" Yes." It had been years, but she'd grown up on a farm before her parents died, before she'd had to make her own way in the world. He indicated a second horse tied nearby, a calm-looking mare with intelligent eyes. "That's Buttermilk. She knows the way if you give her her head." Without waiting for a response, he swung up onto his bay with the easy grace of a man who'd spent more time in the saddle than out of it. Nora approached the mare slowly, running a hand along her neck before attempting to mount. Her skirts made it awkward, and she had to hitch them higher than was strictly proper. But Merrick had already turned his horse toward the trail. If he noticed her struggle, He gave no sign. They rode in silence as the town fell away behind them. The trail wound north through stands of cottonwood and pine, climbing gradually into the foothills. The wind picked up, driving ice crystals against her exposed skin. Nora pulled her shawl tighter, grateful for the mare's steady gait and warm back. She studied Merrick's back as they rode, trying to reconcile this taciturn man with the letter she'd received through the employment agency. The handwriting had been neat but spare. Need cook, room, board, and fair wages. Start immediately. C. Merrick, Box Canyon Ranch. No flowery promises, no elaborate descriptions, just the facts, which had been refreshing after years of men who talked too much and meant too little. The trail narrowed as they climbed higher, forcing them to ride single file. Snow began to fall in earnest, large flakes that stuck to her eyelashes and melted against her cheeks. Her fingers grew numb inside her thin gloves, but she didn't complain. She'd learned long ago that complaining only made hard things harder. Not much further, Merrick said over his shoulder, the first words he'd spoken in an hour. They crested a ridge and Nora caught her breath. The valley below stretched wide and white, bordered by dark forests and distant peaks. A cluster of buildings sat in a protective hollow, a main house, barn, and various outbuildings, smoke rising from multiple chimneys. It looked solid, permanent, like it had grown from the land itself rather than being built upon it. "It's beautiful," she said without thinking. Merrick glanced back, and she thought she saw surprise flicker across his features. "Gets lonesome in winter." "I'm acquainted with lonesome." The words slipped out before she could stop them. Too revealing. But Merrick simply nodded and urged his horse down the trail. As they descended into the valley, Nora tried to imagine herself in this place, cooking in that kitchen whose chimneys sent up such steady smoke, walking between house and barn through snow like this, living alongside this silent man who asked no questions and offered no false promises. It seemed both impossible and inevitable, like a dream she was still falling into. The horses picked up their pace as they neared the ranch, eager for warm stalls and grain. Other men emerged from the barn ranch hands by their dress and bearing. They watched her arrival with curious eyes, but kept their distance. Merrick dismounted near the main house and came around to help her down, his hand steady and impersonal at her waist. "I'll show you the kitchen," he said. "Then your room." Your room, not the servants' quarters or the back corner where the help stayed. Your room, like she was a person with a right to space of her own. Such a small thing, but it loosened something in her chest. The kitchen was better than she'd dared hope. Clean, well-stocked, with a massive iron stove that radiated warmth. Pots hung from hooks along one wall, and the pantry's shelves were lined with preserves and dry goods. Everything spoke of order and care, though dust on some surfaces suggested it had been a while since anyone had given it proper attention. "The men take their meals at 6 and 6, Merrick said from the doorway. "Noon meal they usually fend for themselves unless you're of a mind to make something. Sundays are yours unless we're branding or bringing in a herd." She nodded, already cataloging what needed doing. "How many hands?" 4 regular, sometimes more during roundup. He studied her for a moment. "You need anything from town, make a list. I go in every 2 weeks." "Thank you." He showed her to a small room off the kitchen, her room. It had a narrow bed with a decent mattress, a washstand, a small wardrobe, and, best of all, a tiny stove of its own. The window looked out toward the mountains. It was more privacy than she'd had in years. "I'll leave you to settle in." Merrick said, "Supper's usually just coffee and biscuits on Saturdays. The men won't expect more tonight." He turned to go, then paused in the doorway. "Miss Doyle, whatever brought you here, whatever you're running from, that's your business. Long as you can cook and keep your word, we'll get along fine." Then he was gone, boots echoing down the hall. Nora stood in the middle of her new room, satchel still clutched in her arms. She'd been braced for questions, for suspicious looks, for the moment when she'd have to decide how much truth to tell. Instead, this man had offered her exactly what the letter promised: work, shelter, and the blessed gift of not having to explain herself. Outside, the snow fell harder, blurring the world beyond her window into soft white shapes. Somewhere in this house. Cade Merrick went about his evening, asking nothing of her but honest work. It felt like a miracle, small and quiet as snowfall. But she'd learned not to trust miracles. They had a way of demanding payment when you least expected it. Still, she unpacked her few belongings, 2 dresses, undergarments, her mother's Bible, the handful of recipes she'd written down over the years. She hung her spare dress in the wardrobe and placed the Bible on the small shelf by the bed. Then she tied on her apron and went to make coffee and biscuits for men who didn't yet know her name. It was a beginning. After Cedar Junction, after the mining camps, after years of being looked at but never seen. It was something, and for now, something was enough. 3 weeks into her employment at the Box Canyon Ranch, Nora had established a rhythm. Up before dawn to start the stove, coffee brewing by the time the first ranch hand stumbled in, breakfast on the table as the sun crept over the eastern peaks. The men Tom, Samuel, Jorge, and young Billy ate heartily and spoke little, which suited her fine. They thanked her for the meals and kept their distance, perhaps warned by their boss or perhaps simply following his example. Cade Merrick remained a puzzle. He took his coffee black, ate whatever she put in front of him without comment, and left notes when supplies ran low. Need flour, one might say. Or, bacon's getting low. Always in that same neat handwriting, always signed with just his initials, C.M. She'd grown accustomed to his silences, the way he moved through the house like a shadow at odd hours, checking on sick calves or mending tack by lamplight. Sometimes she'd find evidence of his presence, a cup rinsed and left by the sink, muddy boot prints he'd tried to wipe clean, a load of firewood stacked by her kitchen door that hadn't been there the night before. It was the firewood that unsettled her most. She'd mentioned just once that the wood box was getting low. The next morning, it was full. Not just full, but stacked neat as you please. The kindling separated from the larger logs. No note, no acknowledgement. Just the quiet evidence of attention paid. This morning was different. She'd risen as usual, but the kitchen felt wrong somehow. Too still. The storm that had been threatening for days had finally arrived in earnest, and snow fell thick enough to blur the barn from view. But it wasn't the weather that made her pause at the kitchen door. Merrick sat at the table, fully dressed despite the early hour, staring at a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. His shoulders were rigid, his jaw set in a way that made the muscle there jump. She'd seen him tired. She'd seen him focused. But she'd never seen him like this, like something was breaking inside him that he wouldn't let show. Mr. Merrick, she kept her voice soft, the way she might approach a spooked horse. Are you well? He looked up, and for a moment his careful control slipped. She saw something raw in his gray eyes before he shuddered it away. Just thinking, Miss Doyle, don't mind me. She should have left it there. A wiser woman would have busied herself with breakfast preparations and pretended not to notice the date on the calendar, December 15th, circled in red ink. But wisdom had never been her strongest virtue. Would fresh coffee help with the thinking? A ghost of a smile touched his lips. It might. She poured the cold coffee out and set about making fresh, aware of him watching her movements. Not in the way men usually watched her, calculating, measuring, just watching. Like her presence was something to puzzle out. My wife died 3 years ago today. The words dropped into the kitchen's quiet, like stones into still water. Nora's hands paused on the coffee pot, but she didn't turn around. Sometimes the most important conversations happened when you weren't looking at each other. I'm sorry, she said simply. Fever took her. Nothing anybody could do. His voice was steady, but she heard the weight beneath it. Elizabeth. Her name was Elizabeth. Nora poured the fresh coffee and set it before him, then surprised herself by sitting down across the table. In 3 weeks, she'd never sat at this table except to eat her own quick meals after the men were fed. "Tell me about her." He looked up, startled. People probably offered condolences, she realized, but few asked him to remember. His hands wrapped around the hot cup, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. "She laughed at everything," he said finally. "Even my terrible jokes. Especially my terrible jokes. Said I was too serious for my own good, and she was going to spend her life proving that smiling wouldn't crack my face." "Did she succeed?" "Sometimes." He took a sip of coffee. "She'd have liked you. Would have said I was a fool for leaving notes instead of talking like a civilized person." "The notes are fine," Nora said quickly. "I appreciate a man who says what needs saying and no more." He studied her then, really looked at her for the first time since that day at the stage station. "That why you came out here, to get away from men who talk too much?" It was the closest he'd come to asking about her past. She could deflect, make some light comment, and retreat to her cooking, but he'd offered her truth on this hard morning. Maybe she owed him a little in return. "Something like that," she said carefully. "Sometimes words are just another kind of trap." Understanding flickered in his eyes. He didn't press, didn't ask for details she wasn't ready to give. Just nodded and drank his coffee while she started breakfast. But the silence between them felt different now, not empty but full of things that didn't need saying yet. The storm worsened as the day wore on. By noon, the ranch hands couldn't make it to the barn safely. Merrick strung rope guidelines between buildings and sent everyone to check on the stock. Nora kept coffee hot and soup simmering, feeding men as they stumbled in from the blizzard, half frozen and exhausted. It was near dusk when Billy burst through the door. "Mister." Merrick's horse came back without him. The kitchen erupted. Tom was already pulling on his coat while Samuel gathered lanterns. But it was Nora who thought to ask. Which section was he checking? "North pasture," Jorge said. "Where that old line shack is." She knew that shack. She'd seen it on her one trip to town with the supply wagon. Half collapsed and miles from the main ranch. If Merrick was hurt out there in this storm. "I know the way," she heard herself say. "I can help look." "Ma'am, no disrespect, but," Tom started. "I grew up in harder country than this." She cut him off, already reaching for her coat. "And another pair of eyes won't hurt." They looked to Billy, the youngest, but oddly the one they deferred to in crisis. He nodded slowly. "Jorge, you and Miss Nora take the northern route. Tom and Samuel. Come with me on the eastern trail. We meet at the shack. Anyone finds him, fire 3 shots. Nora wrapped every piece of warm clothing she owned around herself and followed Jorge into the white fury of the storm. The rope guidelines ended at the barn, and after that it was just the two of them fighting through drifts that reached her knees. Jorge broke trail, but even so, she was breathing hard within minutes. "Why'd you volunteer?" Jorge shouted over the wind. "You don't owe him nothing." She didn't answer because she didn't know, because he'd stacked her firewood without being asked, because he'd trusted her with his grief this morning, because for 3 weeks he'd looked at her like she was just a person, not a woman with a past. The line shack loomed out of the snow like a broken tooth. No horse, no sign of Merrick. Jorge was already turning to check the next likely spot when Nora caught his arm. "Wait." She pointed to what might have been a shadow or might have been nothing. "There." They found him slumped against a rock outcropping 50 yards from the shack. His horse's reins still wrapped around his wrist, though the animal was long gone. Blood had frozen on his temple where something, a branch, a rock had struck him. His lips were blue, his breathing shallow. "Get him up," Jorge commanded. "All business now. We carry him together or we all freeze out here." They half-dragged, half-carried Merrick to the shack. It wasn't much. One wall had collapsed, and snow drifted through gaps in the roof, but it was better than the open ground. Jorge got a fire started with the dry wood someone had thoughtfully stacked in the corner, while Nora checked Merrick over with gentle hands. "No broken bones I can find." she reported. "But his head's hurt bad, and he's too cold." Jorge fired the 3 shots to signal the others, then looked at her grimly. "We can't move him again tonight. Storm's getting worse." She knew what he wasn't saying. They had fire and shelter of a sort. But Merrick was slipping deeper into that dangerous cold sleep. She'd seen men die from it, their bodies just giving up the fight to stay warm. "Help me get him closer to the fire," she said. They positioned him as near the flames as they dared, but he didn't stir. His breathing grew shallower. Jorge paced the small space, checking the storm every few minutes. "The others will come at first light," he said. "We just have to keep him alive until then." Nora looked at Merrick's still face, remembering how he'd smiled that morning talking about his Elizabeth, how he'd trusted her with that memory, how he'd asked nothing of her but honest work and kept his word about the rest. "Jorge," she said quietly, "turn around." "What?" "Just, please, turn around and watch the door." Understanding dawned in his weathered face. He nodded once and positioned himself with his back to them, rifle across his knees. Nora began unbuttoning her coat, then the wool dress beneath. Not all the way she kept her chemise and petticoats, but enough. Then she carefully worked at Merrick's frozen buttons, apologizing silently for the necessity. When she had his coat and shirt open, she lay down beside him and pulled him against her, wrapping her coat around them both. Body heat, the oldest remedy for killing cold. She'd learned it as a girl when her father saved a neighbor who'd fallen through pond ice. Nothing improper, nothing shameful, just one human keeping another human alive. But as she held Cade Merrick against her, feeling his chest rise and fall, she couldn't help remembering another man's weight. Another night when she'd given what shouldn't have been taken. This was different, she told herself fiercely. This was her choice, her gift. This was saving a life, not losing herself. "You don't get to die," she whispered against his dark hair. "You hear me, Cade Merrick. You don't get to leave me here with 4 hungry ranch hands and a wood box that fills itself. That's not fair." He stirred slightly, mumbling something she couldn't make out. She held him tighter, willing her warmth into his cold body. The fire crackled. Jorge kept his watch, and somewhere in the long hours of that storm-wrapped night, she felt Merrick's breathing deepen and steady. When dawn came pale through the broken walls, bringing Tom and Samuel with a makeshift stretcher, they found her still holding him. His color was better, his breathing normal. The head wound had stopped bleeding. "You saved his life," Samuel said simply. She sat up carefully, making sure the men saw only what was proper, a fully dressed woman who'd done what was necessary. "We all saved him." But when they loaded Merrick onto the stretcher, his eyes flickered open, gray as winter sky. They found hers with surprising clarity. "Nora," he said, just her name. Not Miss Doyle, just Nora, like it was something precious he'd discovered. Then his eyes closed again, and they carried him home through the breaking storm while she walked behind, wondering why the sound of her name in his voice made her feel more naked than she'd been in the dark. The house felt different with Cade Merrick confined to his bed. Not louder, if anything. The ranch hands moved more quietly, spoke in lower tones, but his absence from the daily rhythms created a void Nora hadn't expected to notice so keenly. She found herself listening for his boot falls, looking for his notes by the coffee pot, missing the quiet presence that had anchored the household. Dr. Holcomb from town had come and gone, pronouncing the head injury serious but not fatal, provided Merrick stayed abed for at least a week. "Keep him quiet," the doctor had instructed. "No work, no worry. That knock scrambled his brain some. Rest is the only cure." Easier said than done. By the 3rd day, Nora could hear him moving restlessly overhead, the floorboards creaking with his impatience. She had been sending his meals up with Billy, maintaining the proper distance now that the crisis had passed. But when the boy came down with the lunch tray untouched for the 2nd time, she knew she'd have to intervene. She knocked firmly on his door. "Mr. Merrick, I'm coming in." She found him sitting on the edge of his bed, fully dressed despite the doctor's orders. trying to pull on his boots with hands that shook slightly. His face was still too pale, the bandage on his temple a stark white reminder of how close they'd come to losing him. "You need to be lying down," she said, setting down the fresh tray she'd brought. "I need to check the stock. Snow's been heavy, and Tom and Samuel have it well in hand." She moved closer, noting the fine tremor in his hands, the way he had to blink to focus on her. "You hired good men. Trust them to do their jobs." He looked up at her then, and she saw frustration war with something else in his eyes. "Like I trusted you." The words hung between them. They hadn't spoken of that night in the line shack, of the necessary intimacy that had saved his life. Jorge had kept his silence, as she'd known he would. But Merrick remembered. She could see it in the careful way he watched her now. "You did what needed doing," he said quietly. "I owe you my life. You owe me nothing." She busied herself straightening the items on his bedside table, a lamp, a book he'd been trying to read, a glass of water. "I did what anyone would have done." "No." His hand caught hers, stopping her nervous movements. "Not anyone, not everyone would have thought so quick, acted so brave." She should have pulled away. A proper woman would have, but the warmth of his calloused palm against her skin held her still. She remembered the weight of him against her in the dark, how she'd counted his heartbeats through the long night. "I'm not brave," she said. "I was terrified. Of the storm. Of losing you." The admission slipped out before she could stop it. She did pull away then, wrapping her arms around herself. "I mean, the ranch needs you. The men." Nora. Just her name again, soft as snowfall. "Look at me." She did, reluctantly. His gray eyes held that same clarity they'd had when he'd first awakened, like he was seeing past all her careful walls. "I remember," he said simply. "Not all of it, but enough. You held me through that night, kept me warm, kept me alive." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "But more than that, you talked to me, told me about your father saving that neighbor, about learning to make biscuits from your mother, about—" "I talked too much." Heat flooded her cheeks. What else had she said in those dark hours, thinking him too far gone to hear? "You talked just enough." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Gave me something to hold on to, something to come back for." The room felt too small suddenly, too warm despite the winter chill beyond the windows. She retreated to safer ground. "You need to eat something, and then rest, like the doctor ordered." "Will you stay just while I eat?" She should say no, should maintain the boundaries that kept her safe, but something in his voice not pleading, just asking, made her nod. She pulled the chair from his desk closer to the bed and sat primly while he worked through the soup and bread. "Tell me about the men," he said between bites. "Are they managing?" Grateful for the neutral topic, she filled him in on the ranch's daily operations. Tom had taken charge of the hands. Samuel was seeing to the horses. Jorge had repaired the fence line that the storm had damaged. Billy had even been helping her in the kitchen, learning to make biscuits under her patient instruction. "Sounds like the place runs itself," Merrick observed. "Maybe I should take up permanent residence in this bed." "Don't joke about that." The sharpness in her voice surprised them both. "I mean, the men need leadership, direction. You can't—" "Peace, Nora." He set the empty bowl aside. "I'm not going anywhere." Such simple words, but they loosened something in her chest. She stood quickly, gathering the dishes. "You should rest now." "Will you come back later? I mean, maybe bring your mending or something. It's—" He paused, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "It's too quiet up here alone." She thought of all the reasons she should refuse, the propriety of it, the danger of growing too comfortable in his presence, the way her name sounded in his voice. "After supper," she heard herself say, "just for a while." That became their pattern over the following days. She'd tend to her duties, cook for the hands, keep the household running, but in the evening, She'd climb the stairs with whatever task could travel mending. Menu planning, sometimes just her knitting. They'd sit in companionable silence. Or he'd ask her about her day. Or she'd read aloud from the book on his nightstand when his head pained him too much to focus on the words. It was during one of these quiet evenings that he asked, "Where did you learn to cook? Really cook? I mean, not just fill bellies, but make food that tastes like home." She smiled, her needle pausing in its path through a torn shirt. "My mother first, then a woman named Mrs. Chen at the first boarding house where I worked." A Mrs. Chen. Her husband worked the railroads. She ran a boarding house in Sacramento, cooked Chinese food for the workers and American food for everyone else. Taught me that food was more than just sustenance. It's comfort, memory. Sometimes it's the only home people have. He was quiet for a moment. "Is that why you came west looking for home?" The question cut closer than he probably intended. She focused on her stitching. "I came west because there was nowhere else to go. Running from something. Aren't we all?" He shifted against his pillows, and she could feel him studying her. "I wasn't running when I came here. Elizabeth and we were chasing something, a dream of what we could build together. Then she died, and I thought about leaving, selling the place, starting over somewhere without memories." "Why didn't you?" "Because the memories were all I had left of her, and because," he paused, "because I'd made promises. To her, to this land, to the men who depend on me. A man who breaks his promises isn't much of a man." The words hit her like cold water. Promises. She'd believed in promises once, had trusted a man who'd whispered them in the dark, who'd sworn that what they shared meant something more than just one night's wanting. "Some promises are made to be broken," she said, her voice harder than she intended. "Some men make them as easy as breathing and forget them just as quick." The silence stretched between them. Then, quietly, "Someone made you promises they didn't keep." It wasn't a question. She set aside her mending, suddenly unable to sit still. "I should go. It's getting late." "Nora." "Good night, Mr. Merrick." She fled before he could say more, taking the stairs too quickly, her heart hammering against her ribs. In the safety of her room, she pressed her back against the door and closed her eyes. She'd said too much. Let him see too much. The careful distance she'd maintained was crumbling, and she didn't know how to shore it up again. The next evening, she almost didn't go upstairs, but habit or something stronger drew her back. She found him sitting up in bed, the lamp casting warm light across his features. He looked better, color returning to his cheeks, though the bandage remained. "I thought you might not come," he said simply. "I said I would." "Yes." He studied her face. "You keep your word." She settled into what had become her chair, picking up yesterday's abandoned mending. They sat in silence for a while, but it wasn't comfortable like before. The air felt charged with unspoken things. "Finally," he said. "I won't ask about the promises someone broke. That's your story to tell or keep. But I want you to know when I make a promise, I keep it. It's about all I have to offer anyone. Just my word and my work." She looked up from her stitching to find his gray eyes steady on hers. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I think you need to hear it. Because I think someone made you believe that all men's words are worthless. And that's a hard way to live." Her throat felt tight. "It's a safe way to live." "Maybe, but safety and living aren't always the same thing." Before she could respond, Billy's voice called from downstairs. "Miss Nora Tom needs you to look at Samuel's hand. Got it caught in the barn door." She rose quickly, grateful for the interruption. "I should—" "Go," Merrick said. "But Nora, think about what I said." She did think about it as she tended Samuel's bruised fingers, as she served the men their supper, as she banked the kitchen fires for the night. She thought about promises and trust and the weight of words. She thought about Cade Merrick's steady gray eyes and the way he'd said her name in the snow. She thought about safety and what it cost, about living and what that might mean. When she climbed the stairs one more time to check on him before bed, she found him sleeping, the book open across his chest. She carefully marked his place and set it aside, turned down the lamp, and stood for a moment in the doorway. In sleep, his face lost its careful control. He looked younger, more vulnerable, like someone who'd known loss but hadn't let it make him cruel. "Your words might be worth something, Cade Merrick," she whispered to the darkness. "But I can't afford to find out." Then she closed his door and went to her own cold bed, where promises couldn't reach her and only the wind spoke through the night. The nightmare came as it always did, in the dead hours before dawn when her defenses were weakest. She was back in that small room above the Cedar Junction boarding house, candlelight flickering across rough walls. Calvin Hartley's smooth voice making promises as his hands moved over her skin. "Just this once, my dear, to seal our commitment. Tomorrow we'll be married proper, and then east to Boston, to a real life." But in the dream, when morning came, she couldn't wake up, couldn't escape the moment when she'd found the money on the nightstand, couldn't stop reading that note over and over, "For your troubles." The words echoed, twisted, became voices, all the whispers that had followed her from town to town. That kind of woman, sold herself, no better than she should be. "No," she moaned, thrashing against the tangled sheets. "That's not what... I didn't..." The storm had returned, rattling her window, and the wind's howl merged with her dream voices until she couldn't tell what was real and what was memory. She was burning the money again, watching it curl and blacken, but the smoke filled her lungs and she couldn't breathe. Couldn't... "Nora." The voice came from far away, then closer, a hand on her shoulder, gentle but firm. "Nora, wake up. You're dreaming." She gasped awake to find Cade Merrick sitting on the edge of her narrow bed, his face etched with concern in the lamplight. He was wearing only his pants and an unbuttoned shirt, his feet bare on the cold floor. He must have heard her from his room above, must have come down despite doctor's orders. "You were crying out," he said quietly, "saying don't leave me after... Well, you sounded frightened." Mortification flooded through her. She pulled the quilt up to her chin, acutely aware of her nightgown, her loosened hair, the impropriety of him in her room. "I'm sorry I woke you. I'm fine. You should go back to..." "You're not fine." His voice was steady, matter of fact. "You're shaking." She was... Great tremors ran through her body, whether from the dream or the cold or his presence. She couldn't say. He reached for the extra blanket folded at the foot of her bed and draped it around her shoulders, careful not to touch her more than necessary. "Bad dreams?" he asked, settling back slightly but not leaving. She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Want to talk about it?" "No." Then, softer, "I can't." He was quiet for a moment, studying her in that way he had, like he could read the story written in the curve of her shoulders and the shadows under her eyes. "When Elizabeth died," he said finally, "I had dreams too, still do sometimes. Dreams where she's alive, where the fever never came. Then I wake up and have to lose her all over again." "That's different." "Is it?" He shifted slightly, and she saw him wince. His head was still healing, still painful. He shouldn't be down here, shouldn't be sitting up. "You need to go back to bed," she said. "The doctor said..." "Hang the doctor." But he pressed a hand to his temple briefly. "Tell me something. Nora, in your dream, were you afraid of something happening or something that already happened?" The question was too perceptive. She looked away, toward the window where snow swirled against the glass. "Why does it matter?" "Because if it's something that already happened, then it's over. Done. Can't touch you anymore unless you let it." "It's not that simple." "No," he agreed. "It's not, but it's a start." They sat in silence while the storm raged outside. She should send him away, should insist on propriety. But his presence pushed back the shadows, made the room feel less like a trap and more like a haven. Someone hurt you. Again, not a question. Someone you trusted. She closed her eyes. Please don't. I'm not asking for details. I'm trying to understand. You cook like you're feeding a family, but you flinch when the men get too close. You keep your door locked even though we're miles from anywhere. You work harder than any two people, like you're trying to prove something, or earn something, or maybe atone for something that wasn't even your fault. Each observation landed like a blow, too accurate to deny. You see too much, she whispered. I see what you let me see, which isn't much, but it's enough to know you're carrying something heavy. He paused. I told you I wasn't running when I came here, but after Elizabeth died, I was hiding. Different thing. Maybe, but just as lonely. Then you showed up with your scared eyes and your straight spine, making biscuits that taste like Sunday mornings and keeping your distance like your life depended on it. And I thought, I recognized something. What? Someone else trying to figure out how to be alive when part of them wishes they weren't. The words hung between them, too true to refute. She looked at him then, really looked at him, saw the grief that still lived in the lines around his eyes, the careful way he held himself, the loneliness that matched her own. I didn't sell. The words stuck in her throat. How could she explain that she'd given herself in love and trust? Not for money, but the money left behind had marked her just the same. You don't have to tell me, Cade said. Whatever happened, whoever hurt you, that's yours to keep or share as you choose. But Nora, it doesn't change how I see you. How can you say that when you don't know? Because I know enough. I know you saved my life when you could have let me freeze. I know you feed my men like they matter. I know you talk to the horses when you think no one's listening, and you leave seed out for the birds even though we need every grain. I know you're kind and capable and braver than you think. Whatever happened before, that's just something that happened to you. It's not who you are. Tears burned her eyes. She blinked them back fiercely. You're wrong. What happened? It marked me, changed me. I used to trust people, used to believe in things. Now I just work and keep my head down and hope the past stays buried. But it doesn't stay buried, does it? Comes visiting in the dark hours, like tonight. She nodded miserably. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, can I tell you something? Something I've never told anyone. She looked up, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. The night Elizabeth died, she was delirious with fever. Didn't know me, didn't know where she was. She called me by another man's name. Richard, an old beau from before we married. He swallowed hard. For months after, I tortured myself wondering, did she love him still? Was I second choice? Did she die wishing for someone else? Oh, Cade. His given name slipped out without thought. But then I realized it didn't matter. Whatever she felt or didn't feel in that fevered moment. We'd had 3 good years. 3 years of laughter and work and building something together. The ending didn't erase that. Just like whatever happened to you doesn't erase who you are now. The storm was quieting, the wind dying to a whisper. In the lamplight, his face was all plains and shadows, marked by loss but not destroyed by it. She wanted to tell him everything then about Calvan's promises, about the money that had made her feel like a commodity, about the shame that had driven her west. But the words wouldn't come. Not yet. Instead, she said, you should go back to bed. Your head. He nodded, standing carefully. But before he left, he turned back. That first day, at the stage station, I saw a woman who looked like she expected to be judged and found wanting. But all I saw was someone looking for a fresh start. Same thing I'd want if I was brave enough to leave everything behind and begin again. He moved toward the door, then paused. Lock this behind me if it makes you feel safer. But Nora, you don't need to lock it against anyone in this house. That's a promise, and I keep those. After he left, she sat in the lamp's glow, wrapped in blankets that still held a hint of his warmth. The nightmare felt distant now, chased away by his quiet presence and quieter understanding. She told him she didn't believe in promises anymore, but maybe, just maybe, she was starting to believe in him. Outside her window, the storm clouds began to break, revealing stars sharp as crystal in the winter sky. She thought about what he'd said about endings not erasing middles, about being marked versus being defined. For the first time in over a year, the weight of Calvin Hartley's betrayal felt a little lighter. She didn't lock her door that night. It was a small thing, barely a gesture. But when morning came without dreams, she counted it as a victory. In the kitchen, starting the day's bread, she found a note by the coffee pot in Cade's neat handwriting. "Thank you for the company in the dark hours. Some burdens are lighter when shared. C.M." She tucked the note into her apron pocket where it stayed all day. A small warmth against the winter cold. A promise as quiet as snowfall, and just as certain. The weeks that followed the night of shared confessions passed in a strange new rhythm. Cade had returned to work despite Dr. Holcomb's protests, though he moved more carefully than before, favoring his left side when he thought no one was watching. The easy distance that had defined their early days was gone, replaced by something more complex, not quite friendship, not quite anything else, but weighted with possibility. It was late January when the accident happened. Nora was bringing fresh bread from the outdoor oven when she heard the crash from the barn, followed by shouting. She dropped the bread basket and ran, her boots slipping on the ice-slicked ground. She found chaos a spooked horse had kicked through its stall, and in trying to calm it, Cade had been pinned against the wall. Tom and Samuel were struggling to control the animal while Jorge tried to reach their boss. "His shoulder," Billy called to her. "The horse got his shoulder bad?" When they finally freed him, Cade's face was gray with pain, his right arm hanging at an unnatural angle. "Just popped out," he said through gritted teeth. "Happened before. Jorge knows how to—" "Not this time, boss," Jorge said grimly. "This is worse. Someone needs to ride for the doctor." "I'll go," Billy volunteered, but Nora was already shaking her head. "The doctor's in Millfield until tomorrow, I heard in town yesterday. Billy, ride to the Garrett Ranch. Mrs. Garrett was a midwife. She'll know about dislocations." She turned to the men. "Get him to the house. Careful with that arm." They half-carried Cade inside, his jaw clenched against the pain. Nora directed them to the kitchen, warmer than the parlor and better lit. She'd need to see what she was doing. "Put him in the chair. Tom, get his shirt off. Samuel, bring hot water. Jorge, find me clean cloth for bandages." The men jumped to obey, accustomed now to her quiet authority in crisis. But when Tom started to ease Cade's shirt off, the pain made him cry out a harsh sound that cut through Nora like a blade. "Stop," she said. "We'll have to cut it." She fetched her sewing scissors, trying to keep her hands steady. The shoulder was already swelling, angry purple spreading across his skin. When she began cutting away the fabric, her fingers brushed against his chest, and she felt him tense. "Sorry," she murmured. "I'm trying to be careful." "Not that." His voice was strained. "Just, your hands are cold." They weren't cold. If anything, she felt too warm, too aware of his skin under her fingers, the rise and fall of his breathing. This was different from that night in the line shack when survival had made everything simple. This was broad daylight, the men watching, and her hands on his bare skin feeling anything but medicinal. "There," she said, setting aside the ruined shirt. The damage was clear now, his shoulder grotesquely out of joint, the surrounding flesh already darkening. "Jorge, what did you do last time this happened?" Jorge shook his head. "Last time wasn't this bad. Just pulled and popped back. This needs a doctor." But they didn't have a doctor. What they had was her, and whatever courage she could summon. She'd seen her father handle a dislocation once. Years ago. The memory was faint but better than nothing. "Cade," she said, meeting his pain-clouded eyes. "I think I can fix this, but it's going to hurt. Badly." He nodded tightly. "Do it." "Tom, Samuel, hold him steady. Jorge, when I say, you're going to pull his arm straight out while I guide the joint back. She looked at Billy. Get the whiskey. I don't need, Cade started. Yes, you do. She poured a generous measure when Billy brought the bottle. Drink, that's an order. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. Yes, ma'am. While he drank, she positioned herself, trying to remember exactly how her father had done it. The angle mattered, the direction of pressure. Get it wrong and she could damage the joint permanently. Nora. Cade's good hand caught hers. If you can't, I can. She squeezed his fingers briefly. Trust me. I do. 2 simple words, but they steadied her. She nodded to the men. On 3, 1, 2. On 3, Jorge pulled while she pressed, guiding the joint with firm pressure. Cade's body went rigid, a sound escaping him that was almost animal. For a horrible moment. Nothing happened. Then she felt the joint sliding back where it belonged with an audible pop. Cade sagged in the chair, sweat standing on his forehead, but the relief on his face was immediate. That's better. Don't move yet. She was already wrapping his shoulder, binding the arm against his chest to keep it immobile. Her hands worked automatically while her mind cataloged what else needed doing. You'll need to keep it bound for at least a week. No riding, no lifting, no. Have you seen my shoulder before? The quiet question made her pause. She looked up to find him watching her with those steady gray eyes. Have you, he repeated, seen the scars there? She had, just now, while wrapping the bandages, a pattern of old marks across his back and shoulder, faded but unmistakable. She nodded slowly. Apache raid, 10 years back. Before I met Elizabeth, they had me for 3 days before the army found me. He said it simply, without drama. That's when the shoulder first got damaged. Pops out sometimes if I wrench it wrong. Cade. She didn't know what to say. The scars told a story of survival that made her own past seem smaller somehow. The point is, he continued, I know something about marks that don't fade, about carrying things on your body that remind you of the worst days. His good hand covered hers where it rested on the bandages. But I also know they're just marks. They're not who we are. The kitchen had gone quiet. The other men had retreated when had that happened, leaving them alone in the afternoon light. She should pull away, should find some task that needed doing. Instead, she found herself turning her hand palm up, letting their fingers intertwine. Do you ever forget? She asked quietly. Even for a moment. Sometimes, when I'm working a good horse, or watching sunrise hit the mountains, when I taste your biscuits and remember what home feels like. His thumb traced a small circle on her palm. When I see you smile, really smile, not the careful one you wear for protection. I don't. This morning, when that barn cat had her kittens in the feed bin, you smiled then, when you thought no one was looking, like the world had given you a small gift. She had to look away from the warmth in his eyes. You see too much. Or maybe you're starting to let yourself be seen. The words hung between them, invitation and challenge both. She carefully extracted her hand, needing distance to think clearly. You should rest. I'll bring supper up later. Nora, she paused at his voice. Thank you, not just for the shoulder, for not looking at me different. After seeing the scars. She understood then what he was really saying, that he'd shown her his marks as she'd shown him hers, not the physical ones, but the ones that counted, that they were, in some fundamental way, equally exposed. We all have scars, she said softly. Some are just easier to see than others. She busied herself with supper preparations, aware of him watching from the chair. When Tom came to help him upstairs, she kept her eyes on her work, but she felt the weight of his gaze like a physical thing, warm and patient and utterly unsettling. That night, after the men were fed and the kitchen cleaned, she climbed the stairs with a tray. She found him propped up in bed, trying to read one-handed. This is harder than it looks, he said. setting the book aside. Most things are. She set the tray on his bedside table. How's the pain? Manageable. That trick with the binding helps. He studied her as she adjusted his pillows. Where'd you learn to handle dislocations? My father, he was practical about such things. Said a person never knew what skills they'd need in life. She smiled faintly at the memory. Though I don't think he imagined I'd use them on a stubborn rancher who won't rest when he's told. I'll rest, but only if you stay a while, like before. It had become their routine during his recovery from the head injury. But this felt different. Everything felt different since that morning, since his hand on hers and talk of scars and seeing. Just for a bit, she conceded, settling into the familiar chair. They talked of small things, the ranch, the men, the foaling season coming in spring, but underneath the ordinary words ran a current of awareness. She noticed things she shouldn't, the way lamplight caught in his dark hair, still mussed from pain, the strength in his good hand as it rested on the quilt, the way he looked at her like she was something worth patience. Can I ask you something? He said eventually. You don't have to answer. She tensed but nodded. Do you think you'll ever trust again, really trust? I mean, not just get by, but actually believe someone when they give their word. The question cut deep, but his tone was gentle, genuinely curious rather than pushing. She considered her answer carefully. I don't know, she admitted. I want to. Sometimes I think I'm starting to, but then I remember how wrong I was before, how completely I misjudged. She trailed off, unable to finish. Maybe you didn't misjudge. Maybe he just lied well. Maybe. She pleated her apron between her fingers. Or maybe I wanted so badly to believe that I ignored what should have been obvious. What should have been obvious? That I was just convenient, available. That what I thought was love was just opportunity for him. Cade was quiet for a long moment. Then, I can't speak to what he felt, but I can tell you this: nothing about you suggests convenient or available. Everything about you suggests careful and valuable and worth earning. The words threatened to undo her completely. She stood abruptly. I should go. You need rest. Nora. She paused at the door. I meant what I said, every word. She fled before her composure could crack entirely, but in her room, pressing her back against the closed door, she found herself believing him. Not completely, not enough to lower all her walls, but a start, a crack in the armor she'd built so carefully. Through her window, stars wheeled in the clear winter sky. Somewhere in the house, floorboards creaked as Cade shifted in his bed. She thought about scars and trust and the terrifying possibility of being seen, really seen, and still found worthy. It would be easier to stay hidden, to keep her distance, to protect herself from any possibility of hurt. But easier and better weren't the same thing. Cade had taught her that. Tomorrow she would rebind his shoulder, and their fingers might touch, and she would try not to run. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. Christmas Eve arrived with a gentleness unusual for the season. Snow falling soft as flowers sifted from heaven. The ranch had been transformed over the past week. Jorge and Billy had cut pine boughs to deck the main room, while Tom and Samuel had constructed a rough but serviceable table to accommodate everyone for the holiday meal. Even the horses seemed to sense the occasion, nickering softly in their stalls as if joining the quiet celebration. Nora had been cooking for 3 days straight, not the simple, hearty fare that usually graced the ranch table, but dishes that carried memory and meaning. Her mother's sage dressing, the apple pie recipe Mrs. Chen had taught her, yeast rolls that required patience and careful timing. She'd even managed a cake, decorating it with crystallized wild berries she'd preserved in sugar last fall. It was while she was putting finishing touches on the meal that Cade appeared in the kitchen doorway. He'd been scarce lately. His shoulder finally healed, but something else keeping him distant. She'd catch him watching her sometimes with an expression she couldn't read, but when their eyes met, he'd find some task that needed his attention elsewhere. Smells like heaven in here, he said quietly. She looked up from the gravy she was stirring, startled to find him dressed in what must be his best clothes. A clean white shirt, dark vest, string tie knotted carefully at his throat. His hair was damp and combed back, and he'd shaved with particular care. He looked handsome, achingly so. "You're early," she managed. "Dinner won't be ready for another hour." "I know. I wanted—" He stepped into the kitchen, and she saw he was holding something behind his back. "I have something for you. For Christmas." "Cade, you shouldn't have—" "Please." He brought forth a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with ribbon that looked suspiciously like it had been cut from one of the decorative boughs. "It's not much, but I wanted you to have it tonight, before the others come in." She wiped her hands on her apron and accepted the package, aware of how her fingers trembled slightly. Inside the paper was fabric-soft blue calico sprigged with tiny white flowers. Enough for a dress, she realized. A Sunday dress, not work clothes. "I asked Mrs. Garrett to pick it out," he said quickly, as if worried she might think he'd been too forward. "Told her I wanted something pretty, something that wasn't about work or keeping warm or being practical, something just because—" Tears burned behind her eyes. When was the last time anyone had given her something just because? Not payment for services, not compensation for something taken, but a gift freely given. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "There's more." He looked almost shy, this man who faced down wild horses and winter storms without flinching. "I was hoping, that is, I'd like to ask, would you sit with me at dinner tonight? Not serving, not jumping up to fetch things, just sitting and eating with the rest of us, with me." The invitation was about more than dinner, and they both knew it. To sit at the table instead of serving it, to take her place as something more than hired help, it was a declaration of sorts. The men would see, would understand that something had shifted between their boss and the cook. "I don't have anything suitable to wear," she said weakly. "What you're wearing is fine." "You look—" He paused, color rising in his cheeks. "You always look fine to me, Nora, whether you're covered in flour or fresh from fighting through a blizzard. But if you'd rather not, if it's too soon or too much, I understand." Too soon for what, too much of what, but she knew. They'd been dancing around it for weeks now, this thing between them that was more than employer and employee, more than friendship, but not yet anything they could name. "I'll sit with you," she heard herself say. The smile that broke across his face was worth any amount of gossip the hands might share. "Good. That's good." He turned to go, then paused. "Nora, I know this isn't the life you probably imagined for yourself. I know you've been hurt before, and trusting doesn't come easy. But I want you to know you sitting at my table tonight, that means something to me. You mean something to me." Before she could respond, he was gone, leaving her clutching the blue calico and fighting tears. She looked down at the fabric, running her fingers over the soft material. A dress for Sundays, for special occasions, for a woman who was more than her work, more than her past. She thought suddenly of that other gift. A year ago now, $40 left on a nightstand, like payment for services rendered. The memory still stung, but it had lost some of its poison. That had been transaction masquerading as affection. This was affection offered with no expectation of transaction. The difference mattered. An hour later, when she entered the main room where the men had gathered, conversation stopped. She'd changed into her better dress, not new, but clean and carefully pressed. Her hair was pinned up properly instead of in its usual practical bun. She looked, she hoped, like a woman attending Christmas dinner rather than a cook serving it. Cade rose immediately, pulling out the chair beside him, the one that would have been Elizabeth's, she realized with a start. But there was no hesitation in his gesture, no shadow of grief, just quiet certainty as he waited for her to sit. The meal was everything she'd hoped, the men exclaiming over each dish. Stories flowing with the wine Tom had produced from some secret cache, laughter warming the room more thoroughly than the fire crackling in the hearth. But what she noticed most was Cade beside her, the solid presence of him, the way he made sure her glass stayed full and her plate never empty. "This is the best Christmas dinner I've had in years," Samuel declared, raising his glass. "To Miss Nora, who makes this old place feel like home." "To Miss Nora," the others echoed, but Cade raised his glass to her alone, his voice quiet enough that only she could hear. "To new beginnings." After dinner, the men produced small gifts for each other, whittled figures, new gloves, a harmonica that Billy immediately began to play with more enthusiasm than skill. Nora had prepared small packages of cookies and preserves for each of them, which were received with touching gratitude. As the evening wound down and the men began to drift toward their quarters, Cade touched her elbow lightly. "Walk with me." She fetched her shawl and followed him onto the porch. The snow had stopped, leaving the world crystalline and perfect under a sky brilliant with stars. Their breath clouded in the cold air as they stood side by side, not quite touching. "Thank you," he said, "for tonight, for making it special." "I just cooked dinner." "No." He turned to face her. "You made it home. You made us family, at least for tonight. That's a gift. Nora, one I didn't know I was missing until you brought it back." The moonlight silvered his features, softening the weathered lines and making him look younger, more vulnerable. She thought of all the reasons she should step back, should maintain the careful distance that had protected her for so long. Instead, she found herself stepping closer. "You gave me gifts too," she said softly. "The fabric, yes, but more than that. You gave me a place where I could just be. No questions, no judgments, no expectations except honest work. You gave me room to breathe again." "Is that enough?" His voice was rough. "Because I find myself wanting to give you more. Wanting to promise you things I'm not sure I have the right to promise." "What kind of things?" He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered against her cheek. Safety, certainty, a life where you never have to run again. A man who sees you really sees you and counts himself lucky for the view. Her breath caught. "Cade, I know you're not ready. I know trust comes hard and for good reason. But I'm a patient man. Nora Doyle, I can wait. I will wait. For as long as it takes you to believe that not all promises are lies." She covered his hand with hers, holding it against her cheek. "What if I'm never ready? What if I'm too broken to—" "You're not broken." His thumb stroked across her cheekbone. "Wounded, maybe. Wary, certainly, but not broken. Never that." Standing there in the Christmas starlight, his hand warm against her skin and his eyes holding promises he seemed determined to keep, she felt something shift inside her chest. Not her walls coming down, not yet, but maybe a door opening. Just a crack, just enough to let in the possibility of light. "I'm not good at this," she whispered. "At trusting, at believing. The last time I tried—" "This isn't last time." His voice was fierce with quiet conviction. "I'm not him, whoever he was, and you're not who you were then either. We're both different people, carrying different scars, trying to build something different." "What are we building?" "I don't know yet, but I'd like to find out, if you're willing." She thought of the blue calico waiting in her room, of sitting at his table as an equal, of the way he'd said her name like it was something precious. She thought of all the small kindnesses, the stacked firewood, the notes by the coffee pot, the way he'd shared his grief on the anniversary of Elizabeth's death. She thought of his promise that night in her room. "You don't need to lock it against anyone in this house." "I'm willing to try," she said finally. "But slowly, carefully. I need—" "Time. I know. You can have all you need." He lowered his hand but didn't step away. "Just don't run, Nora. Whatever happens, whatever you're feeling, talk to me first. Don't just disappear one morning because something spooked you. Promise me that much." It was a fair request, more than fair. "I promise." "Then that's enough for tonight. More than enough." He smiled, and she saw the boy he must have been before loss and responsibility carved their marks on him. "Merry Christmas, Nora." "Merry Christmas, Cade." They stood there a moment longer, the space between them charged with possibility. Then, by mutual accord, they turned back toward the house. At her door, he paused. "The blue will suit you," he said. "When you're ready to make it up. I mean, there's no rush. I like thinking of you in something soft. Something that's yours because you want it, not because you need it." After he'd gone upstairs, she sat on her bed with the fabric across her lap, running her fingers over the tiny flowers. Such a simple gift, but it felt like a promise, not of what he wanted from her, but of what he wanted for her. Beauty, softness, the luxury of choosing something just because it pleased her. For the first time in over a year, she found herself looking forward instead of back, found herself wondering what a dress made from this fabric might look like, where she might wear it, who might see her in it. Found herself believing, just a little, in the possibility of someday. It was the best Christmas gift she could have asked for, better than fabric or feast, or even the carefully offered promise of patience. It was hope, fragile as spun glass but real as the Wyoming stars. She folded the fabric carefully and placed it in her trunk. Tomorrow she would rise early and make breakfast for men with sore heads and full hearts. But tonight, she would fall asleep thinking of blue flowers and steady gray eyes, and the terrifying, wonderful possibility of learning to trust again. The January thaw came unexpectedly, turning the ranch into a muddy mess but bringing with it a restlessness that had been building through the long winter months. Nora had finished the blue calico dress, working on it in the evenings by lamplight, and hung it carefully in her wardrobe. She hadn't worn it yet, somehow the right moment hadn't come. Or perhaps she hadn't been ready for what wearing it might mean. Things between her and Cade had shifted into something new since Christmas. Not courtship exactly, but a careful dance of two people learning each other's rhythms. He took his coffee in the kitchen now instead of the dining room, lingering to talk while she prepared breakfast. Sometimes their fingers would brush as she handed him his cup, and the contact would echo through her for hours. It was on one of these mild afternoons that she decided to walk to the creek. The sun was warm enough to go without her heavy coat, and she needed the space to think, to breathe, to sort through the feelings that seemed to tangle tighter with each passing day. She found him there, sitting on a fallen log beside the water, his hat beside him and his face turned up to the weak winter sun. He looked younger in the soft light, almost peaceful, though she could see the tension in his shoulders that never quite left him. "I'm sorry," she said, starting to back away. "I didn't mean to intrude." "You're not." He shifted over, making room on the log. "I come here to think sometimes. Expect you do the same." She hesitated, then sat, careful to leave space between them. The creek burbled cheerfully, swollen with snowmelt, carrying winter away bit by bit. "What do you think about?" she asked after a moment. "Today, the future, spring coming, calves to birth, fences to mend, whether to buy that bull from Henderson's place." He picked up a stick and traced patterns in the mud. "And you." The simple admission made her heart skip. "Me? I think about you more than I should, probably. Wonder what you're thinking when you get that distant look. Wonder if you're happy here. Wonder if you'll stay." "Where would I go?" "Anywhere you wanted. You're a fine cook. Nora, any household would be lucky to have you. Someone in town, maybe, where life's easier. Or back east where—" He trailed off. "Where what?" "Where no one knows your history. Where you could start fresh without people wondering about your past." She was quiet for a moment, considering, do people wonder the hands, or in town? Some, but not unkindly. far as I can tell. You've earned respect with your work and your ways." He glanced at her. "Does it bother you, the wondering?" "It used to feel like everyone could see right through me, could tell just by looking what kind of woman I was, or what kind I'd been made into." She picked at her skirt. "But lately I care less about what strangers think." "What changed?" "You," she said simply. "The way you look at me, like I'm worth looking at, worth knowing. If you can see past what happened, maybe it doesn't define me as much as I thought." He turned to face her fully then. "Nora, I need to tell you something. About seeing past things." Something in his tone made her tense. "What?" "That first day, at the stage station, I knew who you were. Or rather, I'd heard about a woman matching your description. From the camps." He held up a hand when she started to speak. "Not details, not gossip. Just that there was a woman who'd been disappointed by someone, who'd left quickly after." Shame flooded through her, hot and sick. "You knew all this time." "I knew there'd been trouble. I didn't know what kind and didn't care to." "Still don't, unless you want to tell me." He caught her hand when she started to rise. "Please, let me finish." She sank back down, her hand cold in his warm one. "I hired you anyway. Not out of pity, not because I thought anything. I hired you because you stood straight despite looking like the world had beaten you down. Because you met my eyes direct, even scared as you were. Because I recognized something in you. I'd felt myself the need to be somewhere else. Someone else. At least for a while." "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I don't want lies between us, even lies of omission. Because if we're building something, and I think we are, it should be on honest ground." He squeezed her hand gently. "And because I need you to know that nothing I've said or done has been because I thought you were easy, or available, or any other ugly thing you might fear. It's been because you're you, Nora, just you." She studied their joined hands. His brown and scarred from work, hers reddened from washing and cooking. Working hands, both of them, honest hands. "The man," she said slowly. "His name was Calvin Hartley. He promised marriage, a life back east. I believed him because I wanted to, because I was 27 and tired of being alone. When he suggested we anticipate our wedding night, I thought it meant something, that I meant something." She swallowed hard. "I woke up to money on the nightstand. $40, like that's all it had been to him." Cade's hand tightened on hers, but he didn't speak. "I burned the money, packed what little I had and ran. I've been running ever since. I think, until here, until you." "I'm glad you stopped running," he said quietly. "Glad you stayed." "So am I." The admission surprised her with its truth. "I didn't expect to be, but I am." They sat in silence for a while, hands linked, watching the water carry winter away. Finally, Cade spoke again. "I'd like to kiss you, Nora Doyle. I've been wanting to for weeks now. But I need to know it's what you want too. Not because you think you owe me, not because you're grateful or lonely or any other reason except that you want it." Her heart was hammering so hard she was sure he could hear it. "I don't know if I remember how to want things for myself. It's been so long since I let myself." "Then maybe start small. Do you want to stay here on this log with me a while longer?" "Yes." "Do you want to keep holding my hand?" "Yes." "Do you want me to kiss you? Not now necessarily, but someday when you're sure it's your wanting and not old habits or fears." She turned to look at him then, this patient man who offered choices instead of taking them. I think I do want that someday." He smiled, that rare, full smile that transformed his weathered face. "Then someday it is. I'm good at waiting. Remember, what if someday doesn't come? What if I can't? Then we'll have this friendship, partnership, whatever you're willing to give, for however long you're willing to give it." He lifted their joined hands and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. gentle as a prayer. But I have faith in someday. Nora, you're braver than you know. The sun was starting to sink, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. They should head back, start on supper, return to the careful dance of daily life. But for just a moment longer, she let herself sit beside him, their hands linked, possibility humming in the air between them. "Cade," she said as they finally rose to go. Thank you for knowing and hiring me anyway. For waiting, for everything. No need for thanks. We're building something here. You and I don't know what yet, but I'm curious to find out." They walked back to the house side by side, not touching now, but aware of each other in every step. At the kitchen door, she paused. "I made the dress," she said impulsively. "The blue one. It's hanging in my wardrobe." His eyes lit up. "Will you wear it soon?" "Maybe, when there's occasion. I'll make occasion," he promised. "Sunday dinner in town. Maybe, if you're willing." Sunday dinner in town, in public, where everyone would see them together, draw conclusions. It should have terrified her. Instead, she found herself nodding. "I'm willing." That night, as she served supper to the hands, she caught Cade watching her with such warmth that she felt it like a physical touch. When she brought him his coffee, their fingers brushed, and this time she didn't pull away. Such a small thing, but it felt like a victory. Later, alone in her room, she took out the blue dress and held it up to herself in the mirror. It was modest but pretty, the color bringing out her eyes, a dress for a woman who was learning to want things again, learning to choose for herself. She thought of Calvin Hartley, of the money that had tried to make her into something she wasn't. Then she thought of Cade's work-rough hand holding hers by the creek, his promise of someday, his faith that she was brave. Maybe she was. Maybe bravery wasn't about not being afraid, it was about choosing to hope despite the fear, about believing that not all men lied, that not all promises were broken, that sometimes patient hands and quiet words meant exactly what they seemed to mean. She hung the dress back carefully and prepared for bed. Tomorrow would bring its usual round of cooking and cleaning, of careful distances and cautious closeness. But Sunday she would wear blue calico to town on the arm of a man who saw her truly and wanted her anyway. It wasn't someday yet, but it was closer than yesterday, and that was enough for now. Outside, a Chinook wind began to blow, warm and wild with the promise of change. Spring was coming to the Box Canyon Ranch, and with it, the terrifying, wonderful possibility of new beginnings. The Sunday dinner in town had gone well better than Nora had dared hope. She'd worn the blue calico dress, and Cade had looked at her like she'd hung the moon. The townspeople had been polite, curious but not unkind, and she'd begun to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could build a life here without her past forever shadowing her steps. That belief shattered on a Tuesday afternoon in early March. She was at Morrison's General Store, carefully selecting supplies for the week, when she heard the voice that had haunted her nightmares for over a year. "Well, I'll be damned. Nora Elsbeth Doyle." She froze, her hand still reaching for a tin of baking powder. Every muscle in her body screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. Slowly, she turned. Calvin Hartley stood by the counter, looking exactly as she remembered: immaculate suit, pomaded hair, smile that didn't reach his calculating eyes. He'd put on weight, she noticed distantly. Prosperity had softened his jawline but sharpened the predatory gleam in his gaze. "Mr. Hartley," she managed, her voice steady despite the roaring in her ears. "Is that all the greeting I get after what we shared?" He stepped closer, and she forced herself not to back away. "I've been wondering what became of you. Heard you left Cedar Junction rather precipitously." "I found employment elsewhere." "So I see." His eyes traveled over her, taking in the simple but well-made dress, the color in her cheeks from ranch work and winter sun. "You're looking well. Ranch life agrees with you. If you'll excuse me, I have purchases to complete. Now, no need to be unfriendly. He moved to block her path to the counter, especially since it seems we'll be neighbors of a sort. I'm here on business. The railroad's considering a spur line through this valley. I'm heading up the investment group. Her heart sank. Not just passing through, then he'd be here for weeks, maybe months. I'm staying at the hotel, he continued, voice dropping to a more intimate register. Perhaps we could have dinner, catch up on old times. I'm sure your employer would understand. I think not. Come now, Nora, surely you're not still upset about our little misunderstanding. I thought we'd had an arrangement that satisfied us both. His smile turned sly. I certainly was satisfied. The implication in his words made her skin crawl. Before she could respond, the door chimed and boots sounded on the wooden floor. Nora, the wagon's loaded. You about ready? Cade. She turned to find him in the doorway, taking in the scene with those steady gray eyes, her rigid posture. Hartley's proximity, the tension crackling in the air. Almost finished, she said, grateful her voice didn't shake. Mr. Hartley. This is my employer, Mr. Merrick. Mr. Merrick. Mr. Hartley is someone I knew briefly in Cedar Junction. Briefly, Hartley laughed. Is that what we're calling it? Cade moved then, positioning himself between her and Hartley with the same quiet authority he used with spooked horses. Don't believe we've met, he said mildly. You're the railroad man, I hear. Among other things. Hartley's eyes glinted with malice. I must say, Merrick, you've got yourself a treasure here. Nora's quite accomplished in the kitchen and elsewhere. The muscle in Cade's jaw tightened, but his voice remained level. Miss Doyle's skills in running my household are indeed valuable. Now, if you'll excuse us, we've got a ranch to get back to. Of course. Hartley tipped his hat mockingly. I'm sure we'll be seeing more of each other, small town and all. Nora, do think about that dinner invitation. I'd hate for any misunderstandings about our past to affect my business dealings here. The threat was subtle but clear. Her reputation, Cade's ranch, the railroad spur that could bring prosperity or ruin, all hanging on her response to whatever game Hartley was playing. Good day, Mr. Hartley, she said firmly. Cade's hand was warm at her elbow as he guided her from the store. She was shaking by the time they reached the wagon, her carefully rebuilt world tilting on its axis. Cade helped her up to the seat without comment, then climbed up beside her and set the horses in motion. They were well out of town before he spoke. That's him, the one who hurt you. Not a question, she nodded, not trusting her voice. What did he mean about misunderstandings affecting business? He's threatening to tell people about Cedar Junction, about what happened between us. Make it sound like I was... She couldn't finish. Like you were what he tried to make you into. Cade's voice was hard as granite. Rather than what you are. You don't understand. Men like him, with money and influence, people believe them. And enough of it's true that I can't deny it all. I did go to his room. I did let him. She pressed her hands to her burning cheeks. If he tells his version, no one will want me cooking for them, living under their roof. And if he connects me to you, to the ranch, then what? She looked at him in confusion. What do you mean? Then what? I mean, so what if he talks? You think I care what some pompous railroad investor says? You think the hands care they'd walk through fire for you? Nora, you've made a home for all of us. But your reputation... My reputation is that I keep my word and run an honest operation. Nothing Calvin Hartley says changes that. You don't know how vicious gossip can be, how it spreads and grows and... Nora. He pulled the horses to a stop and turned to face her fully. Look at me. She did, finding his gray eyes fierce with conviction. That man took advantage of you, made promises he didn't keep, left you feeling worthless and ashamed. Those are facts, But here's another fact: you survived it. You picked yourself up, traveled hundreds of miles, built a new life through sheer grit and determination. You saved my life in a blizzard. You've turned my cold house into a home. You've earned the respect of every man on my ranch through hard work and kindness. But I'm not finished. His hands covered hers where they twisted in her lap. You want to know what I see when I look at you? I see a woman who's been knocked down but not broken. I see strength disguised as quiet service. I see someone who deserves better than the hand she was dealt but plays it anyway with grace I can only admire. That's your reputation with me, Nora. That's what matters. Tears spilled down her cheeks. What if he makes things difficult for you? The railroad spur could mean everything for the ranch's future. Then we'll manage without it. Ranch has survived this long without railroad connections. He squeezed her hands. But I won't have you bullied by that man. Not for any amount of money or convenience. I should leave. Go somewhere he can't. Don't you dare. The fierceness in his voice startled her. Don't you dare let him chase you away from the life you've built. From the people who care about you. From... He paused, seeming to gather himself. From me. They stared at each other in the afternoon light. So much hanging unspoken between them. Finally, Cade clicked to the horses and they resumed their journey. What are you going to do? She asked quietly. First, I'm going to take you home. Then I'm going to have a word with Mr. Hartley about appropriate behavior toward the women under my protection. Cade, no, that will only make things worse. Maybe. Or maybe he needs to understand that you're not alone anymore. That you have people who'll stand by you. They rode in silence for a while, the familiar landscape of the ranch coming into view. As they pulled up to the house, Cade spoke again. Whatever he says, whatever stories he spreads, we'll weather it together. You're not facing this alone. Not anymore. That evening, she went through the motions of preparing supper, but her mind kept returning to Calvin's knowing smile, his casual threat. When Cade hadn't returned by the time the meal was ready, worry began to gnaw at her. What if Calvin had twisted things, made Cade believe his version? What if... The door opened and Cade entered, hat in hand. There was a scrape on his knuckles she was sure hadn't been there before. What did you do? She breathed. Had a conversation. He accepted the plate she handed him, made certain things clear. What things? That you're under my protection. That spreading lies about you would be inadvisable. That his business in this valley would go more smoothly if he conducted himself like a gentleman. You threatened him. I informed him of consequences. Cade's smile was sharp. Amazing how reasonable men become when they realize their investment opportunities might dry up. Seems several of the other ranchers share my opinion about men who don't treat women with respect. He could ruin you for this. He could try. Cade set down his fork and looked at her directly. Nora, I need you to understand something. You're not just my cook. You're not just my employee. You matter to me. More than railroad spurs or business opportunities or what the town gossips might say. And I'll be damned if I let him hurt you again. The declaration hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning. Before she could respond, Tom burst through the door. Boss, Ryder coming in fast. Says there's trouble in town. That railroad fellow's been talking at the saloon, saying things about Miss Nora. Cade's face darkened. What kind of things? Tom's ears reddened. Not fit to repeat, sir, but Jake Morse took exception. And now there's fixing to be a fight. Saddle my horse, Cade ordered, already reaching for his gun belt. No. Nora grabbed his arm. Please, this is what he wants: chaos, drama. You defending my honor in some saloon brawl? It just feeds the story he's trying to create. Then what would you have me do? Let him spread his poison? She thought quickly. Let me come with you, to town. Let people see me as I am now, not as he's painting me. Let me face this with dignity instead of hiding. Cade studied her for a long moment. You're sure? No, but I'm tired of running, tired of letting what he did define me. She lifted her chin. I'll wear my blue dress. A fierce pride flickered in his eyes. That's my girl. The endearment slipped out naturally, and they both heard it. But there was no time to examine it now. Within minutes, they were headed back to town. Nora in her blue calico and Cade beside her, solid as the mountains themselves. Whatever waited in town, whatever poison Calvin Hartley was spreading, she would meet it head on. She had something now she hadn't had in Cedar Junction, people who believed in her, who would stand with her. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. The Coyote Hill Town Hall was packed to bursting. Every rancher and merchant and curious townsperson crammed into the modest wooden building. Word had spread like wildfire there was to be a meeting about the proposed railroad spur, and tensions were running high. Calvin Hartley stood at the front, immaculate in his city suit, gesturing at a map spread across a makeshift table. Nora sat between Cade and Mrs. Garrett, her spine straight and her hands folded calmly in her lap, despite the churning in her stomach. She could feel the weight of curious glances, could hear the whispers that followed her entrance. But she kept her chin high, drawing strength from Cade's solid presence beside her. As I was saying, Hartley continued, his voice carrying that polished authority that had once fooled her so completely. The railroad represents progress, prosperity, a future for this valley. My investment group is prepared to make that future a reality for those willing to embrace it. And what's the cost of that embrace? Called out Jake Morse from the back. The saloon keeper's face still bore marks from last night's altercation. Seems to me you're asking us to sell more than right-of-way. Hartley's smile didn't waver. I'm asking for vision. Mr. Morse, the ability to see beyond the limitations of the present, though I understand some people prefer to remain stuck in their circumstances. His eyes found Nora then, lingering with unmistakable meaning. She felt Cade tense beside her, but she placed a gentle hand on his arm. Not yet. The terms are simple, Hartley continued. Those who support the railroad venture will find themselves well positioned for the prosperity it brings. Those who oppose it, he shrugged eloquently. Progress moves forward with or without them. And what does support look like? Exactly. This from Henderson, whose bull Cade had been considering buying. Beyond land rights, I mean... Oh, the usual cooperation. Reasonable prices for supplies, accommodating labor needs, and of course, maintaining the kind of respectable community that railroad investors prefer to work with. Again, that pointed glance at Nora. After all, the company has standards about the places it does business, moral standards. The implication hung heavy in the air. Several people shifted uncomfortably, and the whispers grew louder. That's enough. Cade's voice cut through the murmur like a knife. He stood slowly, drawing every eye in the room. Mr. Merrick, Hartley acknowledged with false courtesy. Do you have a question about the proposal? I have a question about your standards, Mr. Hartley. Specifically, what kind of man uses business negotiations to settle personal grievances? I'm sure I don't know what you mean. Then let me be clearer. Cade moved to the front of the room, his presence commanding despite Hartley's expensive clothes and city polish. You've been spreading stories about a woman under my protection, making implications about her character based on your own actions over a year ago. That strikes me as neither businesslike nor gentlemanly. I've simply shared my experiences, Hartley said smoothly. If the truth is uncomfortable. The truth! Nora found herself standing, the words escaping before she could stop them. Every head in the room turned to her, but she was past caring. You want to talk about truth, Mr. Hartley? Nora, Cade said quietly, but she shook her head. No, he wants to tell stories. Let him tell the whole story. She stepped forward, her voice gaining strength. Yes, I knew Mr. Hartley in Cedar Junction. Yes, I went to his room one night, because he'd spent weeks courting me, promising marriage, a future, a life together. He said we'd be married within the month, that anticipating our vows by a few weeks hardly mattered between two people so much in love. Hartley's confident smile began to slip. Now, Nora. Miss Doyle, she corrected sharply. I gave you the right to familiarity once, never again. She turned to address the room, finding courage in the faces she'd come to know Mrs. Morrison from the general store, Doc Holcomb, the Garrett family. I was 27 years old, alone in the world, and I believed him. That was my mistake. But when morning came, instead of the wedding plans he'd promised, I found money on the nightstand, $40, like I was. Her voice trembled but didn't break, like I was something to be purchased and discarded. The room had gone absolutely silent. Even the children seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. I burned that money, she continued. Left town that same day. And yes, I've been running ever since, until I came here. Until I found a place where people judge me by my work, not my worst moment, where I could build something real instead of chasing empty promises. A touching story, Hartley began, but Henderson cut him off. Let her finish. Nora took a breath. Mr. Hartley says the railroad has moral standards. Well, I'd like to know what's moral about a man who makes promises he never intends to keep. What's moral about following a woman hundreds of miles to threaten her livelihood because she had the audacity to survive his cruelty? What's moral about using business as a weapon to settle petty scores? You dare! Hartley stepped toward her, face flushed with anger. Cade moved faster, placing himself between them. Yes, he said simply. She dares, and she's got every right to. She's a. Choose your next words very carefully, Cade warned, his voice deadly quiet. Because the next lie you tell about Miss Doyle will be the last thing you say in this valley. Are you threatening me in front of witnesses? I'm making you a promise. The difference is, I keep mine. Jake Morse stood up in the back. Seems to me we've heard enough. Man who'd treat a woman that way, then chase her down to ruin her for surviving it, that's not a man I want to do business with. Here, here, called out several voices. Mrs. Garrett rose, her weathered face stern. I've known many women who've made hard choices to survive. Mr. Hartley, some sold their bodies, some sold their souls, but Nora Doyle sold neither. She made an honest mistake trusting a dishonest man. If that's a crime, then half the women in this room are guilty. And the men who stand by while such behavior continues are worse than guilty, added Doc Holcomb. They're complicit. Hartley looked around the room, seeing his carefully orchestrated meeting slipping away. You're making a mistake. The railroad can find another route, Henderson said flatly, or work with more honorable representatives. Either way, I don't think you'll find much cooperation here. You'd turn down prosperity for the sake of a fallen woman. The words had barely left his mouth when Cade's fist connected with his jaw. Hartley went down hard, sprawling across his carefully drawn maps. That's for the insult, Cade said calmly. Get up and I'll give you what you've earned for the rest. Hartley struggled to his feet, dabbing at his bloody lip. I'll sue you. I'll ruin you. Try it. Cade's smile was wolf-sharp. But you'll do it from somewhere else. You've got 1 hour to get out of Coyote Hill. After that, I won't be responsible for what happens. You can't run me out of town. He's not, Jake Morse said, moving to stand beside Cade. We are. One by one, the men in the room stood. Henderson, Doc Holcomb, Morrison from the general store, ranchers and merchants and working men. Even some of the women rose, faces set in determination. 1 hour, Sheriff Watson said quietly. He'd been silent until now, but his star carried weight. Best use it wisely. Hartley looked around the room, finding no sympathetic faces. His gaze landed on Nora last, and for just a moment, she saw him as he really was: small, petty, A man who'd never learned that power over others wasn't the same as strength. "This isn't over," he snarled. "Yes," Nora said quietly. "It is." He gathered his maps and papers, dignity in tatters, and stalked from the room. The silence that followed his exit was profound. Then Mrs. Morrison began to clap. Just her at first, then Mrs. Garrett, then others, until the room filled with applause. Not for the spectacle, Nora realized, but for her, for standing up, for speaking truth, for refusing to be ashamed of surviving. Cade's hand found hers, warm and steady. "You all right?" "I think so." She looked around the room at faces both familiar and strange, seeing acceptance where she'd feared judgment. "Actually, yes, I am." Later, as they drove back to the ranch through the gathering dusk, Cade spoke. "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen." "I was terrified." Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what needs doing, despite the fear. He glanced at her. "You know, this isn't really over. Hartley will make trouble if he can." "Maybe, but I'm done running from him. From what happened. From myself." She smoothed the blue calico over her knees. "I said it in front of the whole town. What I did, and they didn't turn away. Because they saw what I see. A woman who made a mistake trusting the wrong man. Nothing more shameful in that than catching cold in the rain." She studied his profile in the fading light. The strong jaw, the steady eyes, the capable hands on the reins. "How can you be so sure about me? I mean," he pulled the horses to a stop and turned to face her fully. "Because I know you, Nora Doyle. Know your kindness and your strength. Know how you hum when you're happy and go quiet when you're thinking hard. Know you save the best portions for others and make do with scraps yourself. Know you'd ride into a blizzard to save a man who'd never asked you for anything but honest work." "Cade." "I'm not finished." His hands covered hers. "I know you've been hurt so deeply you're afraid to trust again. But I also know you're starting to. I can see it in the way you don't flinch anymore when I come into the kitchen unexpected. The way you let yourself laugh at Billy's terrible jokes. The way you stood up in that room tonight and claimed your own story." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying Calvin Hartley was a fool. Because he had the chance to know you, really know you, and he threw it away for one night's satisfaction. But his loss is my gain. Nora, because you came here, you stayed. You gave me the chance to earn what he stole." "You can't earn what was taken," she said softly. "It's gone forever." "No, he took your innocence. Maybe your ability to trust easily, but not your capacity for love, not your worth. Those things can't be stolen, only given." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm. "And I'm hoping, someday, you might consider giving them to someone who knows their value." The words hung between them in the prairie twilight, profound as prayer. Nora felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of bonds she'd tied around her own heart. "I think," she said slowly, "that someday might be closer than I expected." His smile was like sunrise. "I can wait, however long it takes." As they continued home through the gathering dark, Nora felt lighter than she had in over a year. She'd faced her past, spoken her truth, and found acceptance instead of condemnation. Calvin Hartley had no more power over her. And Cade Merrick, he had all the power she was finally ready to give, not taken, not stolen, but offered freely by a woman who was learning to trust again. It felt like coming home. Spring came early to the Box Canyon Ranch that year, painting the meadows with wild flowers and filling the air with the sound of new calves and nesting birds. Nora stood on the porch, watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold, a cup of coffee warming her hands. The morning was still cool, but held the promise of warmth, much like her life these days. It had been 3 weeks since Calvin Hartley had slunk out of town, his railroad dreams and ugly threats crumbling in the face of community solidarity. The gossip had died down, replaced by acceptance and even admiration for how she'd stood up to him, Mrs. Morrison had made a point of inviting her to join the church auxiliary, and Mrs. Garrett had asked her advice about preserving early vegetables. "You're up early." She turned to find Cade in the doorway, his hair still mussed from sleep, suspenders hanging loose at his sides. He'd taken to joining her for these quiet morning moments before the ranch stirred to life. "The bread needed starting," she said, though they both knew she could have waited another hour. Truth was, she loved these stolen moments of peace, when the world felt full of possibility. He came to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel his warmth, but not quite touching. They'd been dancing this careful dance for weeks now, drawing closer with each passing day, but neither quite ready to take that final step. "Sleep well?" he asked. "No dreams," she confirmed. The nightmares had faded since the confrontation with Hartley, replaced by peaceful sleep and, sometimes, dreams of a different sort. Dreams where strong hands held her gently and gray eyes looked at her with promise. Good. He sipped from his own cup, then cleared his throat. "Nora, I've been thinking." "Dangerous habit," she teased, earning a smile. "Maybe, but spring's here, and with it comes the busy season. New calves, branding, maybe a drive to the railhead if prices hold." He paused, seeming to gather himself. "What I'm trying to say is, the men and I are going to be away from the house more. Long days, sometimes overnight at the far pastures." Her heart sank a little. She'd grown accustomed to his presence, to their evening talks and morning coffees. "I understand." "Do you? Because what I'm trying to say badly is that I don't want to be away so much. Not from the ranch, but not from you." She looked up at him, finding his eyes already on her, warm and serious. "I've been patient," he continued. "Tried to give you time and space to heal, to trust. But spring makes a man think about growing things, about planting seeds for the future, and I need to know, is there a future here for us?" The question hung between them like morning mist, delicate and profound. Nora set down her coffee cup and turned to face him fully. "Do you remember?" she said slowly. "That night in the line shack when I held you through the storm. Every moment, I told myself it was just about keeping you alive, body heat and necessity. But even then, I knew I was lying to myself." She took a breath, gathering courage. "I held you because I couldn't bear to lose you, because somewhere between that first day at the stage station and that night in the snow, you became essential." "Nora." "Let me finish, please." She wrapped her arms around herself, not from cold, but from the vulnerability of truth. "Calvin took something from me. Not just innocence, but faith. Faith that words meant what they seemed to mean, that promises had weight, that love was more than transaction. For over a year, I've been walking through life half dead, sure I'd never feel whole again. And now, she looked out at the awakening ranch, the barn where she'd learned to trust again, the kitchen where she'd rebuilt her sense of worth, the mountains that had witnessed her resurrection. Now I know he was wrong. What I gave him wasn't love. It was hope dressed up as love. Real love is what grows slowly, built on small kindnesses and kept promises and patience that asks for nothing but gives everything." She turned back to him, finding his eyes bright with emotion. "Real love," she continued, voice stronger now. "It's firewood stacked without being asked and notes by the coffee pot. It's standing up to a bully in front of the whole town and riding into a blizzard without hesitation. It's looking at someone's scars inside and out and seeing beauty instead of damage." "Are you saying—" "I'm saying yes. Cade Merrick. Yes to a future. Yes to trust. Yes to whatever you're brave enough to offer and I'm brave enough to accept." The smile that broke across his face was like dawn itself. He set down his cup and reached for her, movements careful and deliberate, giving her every chance to step away. She stepped closer instead. His hands framed her face, calloused thumbs gentle against her cheeks. I want to kiss you, Nora Doyle, not because of gratitude or proximity or spring making me foolish, but because I love you. Have loved you since you saved my life. Maybe since you stepped off that stage looking like you expected the world to knock you down again. I love your strength and your softness, your courage and your caution. I love the woman you were, the woman you are, and the woman you're becoming. That's a lot of women to love, she said, trying for lightness through the tears gathering in her eyes. Good thing I'm a patient man with a lifetime to spend on the project. A lifetime? If you'll have me, I'm not Calvin Hartley. Nora, I don't make promises I won't keep. When I say lifetime, I mean it. Marriage, partnership, building something together that lasts longer than both of us. Children, if we're blessed, growing old on this land, watching seasons change and knowing we're changing with them but never apart. The tears came then, but they were clean tears, healing tears. You paint a beautiful future, Cade Merrick. Is that a yes? That's a yes to all of it, to marriage and partnership and whatever comes. She placed her hands over his where they still cradled her face. But first, that kiss you mentioned. He laughed, soft and wondering. First, last, and always. When his lips met hers, it was nothing like that night in Cedar Junction. This was choosing, not taking, gift, not theft. It was gentle and sure, patient and promising. The kiss of a man who knew the value of what he held and intended to cherish it. When they finally parted, both breathing unsteadily, Nora felt the last of her walls crumble, not destroyed, but transformed from barriers into foundations for something new and strong. Well, she said, voice not quite steady, that was worth waiting for. Everything about you has been worth waiting for. He pulled her close, and she rested her head against his chest, hearing his heart beat strong and steady. When can we marry? Soon, she said, but properly, in the church, with our friends there. I want everyone to see that Nora Doyle chooses Cade Merrick freely, joyfully, completely, and that Cade Merrick counts himself the luckiest man in the territory to be chosen. They stood there as the sun climbed higher, painting their world in gold and green and endless blue. The ranch was stirring horses nickering for breakfast, roosters announcing the day, the hands beginning to move about their morning chores. Soon she'd need to start breakfast. He'd need to plan the day's work. But for now, they had this each other, the morning, and a future bright with promise. I should tell the hands. Cade murmured against her hair. They'll want to know. They already know, Nora said, smiling. Billy's been taking bets on when you'd finally speak up. That scamp, what did he bet? First week of spring. Said you'd wait for new growth to start your own. She pulled back to look at him. Looks like he won. We all won. Cade said seriously. Every man on this ranch has been hoping for this. You made us a family, Nora. Now it's official. From the barn came a whoop. Billy had spotted them and apparently drawn the right conclusions. Soon other voices joined his, and Nora found herself laughing as the hands gathered on the porch, offering congratulations and good-natured teasing. About time, boss, Tom said, grinning broadly. Miss Nora, does this mean your biscuits are staying permanent? Samuel asked hopefully. As permanent as anything gets, she assured him. Jorge said something in Spanish that made Billy blush and the others laugh. When Nora raised an eyebrow, Cade translated. He says love makes fools of wise men and wise men of fools, and he's not sure which I am, but he's happy either way. As the celebration continued, Nora felt a profound sense of rightness settle over her. This was what Calvin Hartley had tried to steal, not just innocence, but the possibility of this moment, surrounded by chosen family, held by a man who saw her truly and loved her anyway. But he'd failed. She'd survived. Traveled miles and months to find herself here. In this place where promises were kept and love was patient and spring brought new beginnings to those brave enough to grasp them. "No more running," Cade murmured in her ear. "No more fear. Just this. Just us. Just home." "Home," she agreed, the word tasting like honey on her tongue. "Forever home." As the morning sun climbed toward noon, painting their valley in light and shadow and infinite possibility, Nora Doyle, soon-to-be Merrick, knew that some stories didn't end with rescue or revenge, but with the quiet triumph of healing, of choosing love despite the risk, of building something beautiful from the ashes of what was burned. And as Cade's arms tightened around her, as their friends celebrated and the ranch stirred to vibrant life around them, she knew this truth: she had been lost, but now was found, had been broken, but now was whole, had been alone, but now, blessedly, permanently, joyfully, was home. The end was really just the beginning. Thank you so much for listening to this story of love, redemption, and second chances in the Old West. I hope Nora and Cade's journey touched your heart as much as it touched mine while sharing it with you. Where are you listening from today? Please share in the comments below. I love connecting with listeners from around the world and hearing your thoughts on the story. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 and hit the like button. And don't forget to press that hype button to help more people discover these stories of courage and love from America's frontier. Until next time, partners.